Hi, and welcome to Governance Alive podcast. I'm your host, Katrina Knight. I'm an associate here at Governance Alive, and we're here today with John Buck, one of the founders of Governance Alive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
John, so I understand that you recently made a trip to Korea to promote your new book, Company-Wide Agility and Beyond Budgeting, Open Spaces, and Sociocracy. While doing this training, was there any kind of, language barriers? So the book was translated, but like during your training,
Mhm.
are you speaking in English while there's a interpreter? Like,
Yeah,
how did all of that
yeah,
go during the training?
that worked really well. I also am a little bit familiar with Korean. I really respect the Korean language. If you look online and ask which language in the world has the highest vocabulary, the biggest vocabulary, it says it's a tie between English and Korean. And Korean is a very well-developed, subtle language. The King Seong in the 1500s developed their alphabet, which I can pronounce Korean just by looking at it, even though I don't know what it means. And so I worked some Korean words in there. I had my own little kind of study to see if I could memorize some Korean words that are hard to translate into English. And I got a few chuckles and smiles when I used them in the class. But some people could understand English fairly well, but most couldn't, and the interpreter did a really good job of translating as we went. And in some ways, it's kind of nice to speak through translation because you have to stop and think, what am I going to say next? And you end up, maybe saying things more clearly. So it was fine.
It's amazing, because even though that there's like a language barrier between you and people in a different country, you're still able to come together and learn. And I think that is really special to be able to everyone to be able to grow together and to learn more about sociocracy.
Yeah, as long as you're aware that there are cultural differences, you can take them into account. And the Korean culture, I happen to really like the culture. It's people are very sensitive, partly reflected in the language, but it's also a very orderly place. I think Seoul is probably the cleanest city in the world. You do not see trash in the gutters. If you go into a parking garage, the floors are well painted and there's no dust in the corners. They just very um, well ordered, orderly people.
So diving into your book, BOSSA Nova,
Mhm.
can you tell us what the primary principles of it are?
Yeah. Um, Basically, what we did, and we is Yuta Eckstein pictured here, and um, and she's an expert in the area called Agile, and my expertise is in sociocracy. Um, and we said that we really want to find a clear way to create company-wide agility. And that means that's kind of based on the fact that the um, software industry back around 2001 adopted something called the Agile Manifesto, which said basically we're not going to do software development like we used to, which was proceeded in a kind of a very orderly engineering way with plans of all sorts, and it produced mediocre software. And Agile um, recognizes that the software development process is complex. It's not like an airplane where you can look at all these scientific principles and design a nice complicated system, but you can design it as an engineer. Software is not like that. It involves people, and you really kind of don't know what works until you started it out and you've done rapid testing. And so it's been so successful that companies have started saying, "Well, gee, we ought to, try to imitate what the software people are doing because that it's been, things are going so well." And in fact, there's a history of traditional business clashing hard with the way software has been developed. And so Yuta and I said, um, there ought to be a way to help companies, regardless of what they were, even if it's a restaurant that cooks fish and there's nothing to do with software, but still take the agile principles and generalize them. And so we initially um, met at an agile conference and gave a presentation on sociocracy and agile, how they could be combined to benefit. And um, that went okay, but when afterwards we were sitting having coffee and saying, what we said was nice, but it's not the whole thing. There's stuff missing. So we said, let's write a book about it, which we did. And we looked for all kinds of other philosophies and approaches to business that uh, would help people also adapt the principles of agile to uh, running a business. And we ended up with looking at a lot of different things, but we ended up saying, well, it's not only sociocracy that's needed, but also something called beyond budgeting that was developed in Norway, and open space. And a lot of you may have been to like an open space event. There's also something called organizational open space. And so we said that all combined um, should help give people the framework that they need to uh, really figure out how to generalize or put agile in the whole company. So that's background to your question, which is what we did is we took the agile principles, and some of you may be familiar with them and some not, but the agile principles are contain like comments about software. You have pay attention to working software rather than documentation, for example. So we said let's think about how we could say those principles from the beyond budgeting standpoint, from sociocracy, from open space, and because you can say those principles with these other methodologies. So we said let's try to generalize the agile principles, uh, working with these different frameworks, and how do we combine the different frameworks and ways of looking at things. So we came up with these four principles right here, plus a fifth one that's not really mentioned that comes from sociocracy. It's called the connected perspective, and I'll not worry too much about that. But these are the principles, and the little diagram here, we discovered that we could create BOSSA Nova out of the initials of the um, four methods that we came up with. So, and the word bossa in Portuguese, I had a fun time in Korea. I said, now who here speaks Portuguese? Of course, nobody did. And uh, I said, all right, bossa is the Portuguese word for wave, and nova is the word for new. So it means new wave. And so this is a new wave in how you run companies. And these are the principles that you can use.
Now, if a company wanted to be more like Agile, they would start with these four basic principles
Yeah, and there's these four principles plus the Nova,
plus the
and
Nova.
yeah, and so what this really means is that um, if you um, pay attention to these principles, then you can think, gee, how's our company operating right now? I wonder if we could do something different, and that's the Nova. And we spent pretty much one of the 2 days, the second of the 2 days, just explaining to people how you probe what's currently happening in your company. Actually, you can do it personally too. What's currently happening, and what of these all these principles and the examples we give in the book do you think might work in your company? And then you do a formal test, and publishing it is the way that you reliably develop new things. And you for that you need a good conceptual framework, so you're not just out there kind of feeling in the dark, but you have some guidance as to what you could try that might work. And that's how a company does it, is they can learn one or more of the beyond budgeting and of the BASA principles. um, they can understand these generalized principles here, and then they can um, do experiments to start changing the way they're doing things. And they may want to introduce even concepts other than the BOSSA principles. This is not the way of doing it, it's a way of doing it. So did I answer your question enough? That's the brief answer is the,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, you
the brief
did.
answer is focus on the Nova. Be very disciplined about doing new things guided by these principles and the concepts of the BOSSA principles, of the BOSSA methods.
So, in order for an organization to be like more like Agile and to start with these principles, if they continue with these principles in the Nova, they will their organization be able to work better and
Yeah, yeah.
thrive?
There's maybe a simple way of trying to explain kind of what it's like when you go do the bossa nova, and that would be like, um, the first question would be, does your company have an annual budget?
Mhm.
And if your company has an annual budget, you're not company-wide agile, because and that question comes from beyond budgeting. Um, if you have an annual budget, for example, and I know if you've been in any kind of large company, you've seen this happen where, oh, it's getting toward the end of the fiscal year. We still have extra money in our budget. And if we don't spend it, then they're going to cut our money next year. So you won't run out and
Mhm.
spend it on things. And it's like, that's not agile. Or um, we have a brilliant idea for a project, and you go to the budget people and they say, well, submit it now and we'll review it. And then the new budget will come out, and then maybe your money will be there for you, and that'll be about 9 months. And so you're sitting there thinking, we got this great idea, and I got to sit here for 9 months waiting for the money to come in. That's not agile. And so when you're operating with beyond budgeting principles, the budget people show up and say, oh, you got a new project. Let us help you find the money. So it's a totally different way. So if you've answered, does your company have an annual budget? Then you can change that. Then you can, have a more agile company by not doing that and following their principles. Um, Another question would be to ask, if you come up with an idea for a new project and you find other people that are interested, and you doesn't not you the executive, but you just a regular person in the organization, can you just do that project without getting permission first? And if you can't answer, oh yes we can, then you're not agile.
Mhm.
For one thing, the hierarchy is there controlling you, and when you're agile, then like in doing software, everybody's out there doing stuff. Everybody's, got roles that let them make decisions about what's happening in that software. And so, um, Spotify is a good example of that. Spotify is doing this principle, which is, um, you can call it organizational open space. They really know how to do that, and they've got a very creative company coming out of that. They are agile. They're not waiting for permission to do a new idea. And there's a lot to be said about this. There should be responsibility. You should be bounded by responsibility, they say. But and something called advice process is useful. But you shouldn't have to ask for permission if the idea seems good. So that's an example of a change that might happen in your company
Mhm.
if you're going company-wide agile.
Yeah, no, that's really important too, because everybody has usually something to contribute to the company. So, but from my understanding, just for being with Governance Alive, is that the facilitating isn't very intuitive sometimes, and it can be a little difficult at first when you're still learning it. So, getting back to Bossa Nova, so you were explaining what makes a company not agile. So what can they do to make sure that they are successful if they start implementing
Yeah,
these principles?
we got to the slide that I brought up. Great. Um, so I've listed some success factors here, and I'll just take them one by one and explain a little bit what that means. Um, One of the companies that has used all the factors in Bossa Nova and was using it before we got there. It was the only one that was using all four that we ran across. is a company called Titansoft. They're a software company that works in Taiwan and Singapore. And their motto is, "We never stop improving." And they're just a nifty company. Provide services in many languages, and um, just they're doing very well. Excuse me, very well. Um, so just having that attitude of we're always going to be testing new things, we're always going to be in the Nova area, is an important kind of value for a company to have. Do reflexive inquiry regularly. Well, that's kind of a weird thing. What's reflexive inquiry? The reflexive inquiry comes out of complexity theory, and when you're doing any kind of business with people, you're really dealing with a complex situation. That means that periodically you stop, and maybe it's every 2 weeks, maybe it's every 2 months, and you say, we need to think about how we're thinking. And oh, we really could be thinking this way, and that leads you to, great Nova type things. Um, in Agile practice, at the end of a sprint, where you're developing software like crazy for a couple of weeks, you deliver whatever you develop, get the customer's feedback, and then sit back and think, what did we learn about that? What happened? And that's in Agile is called a retrospective. Um, so um, in Sociocracy, it's called a circle meeting, and so forth. So um, and beyond budget, it calls it other things. So it's taking time to think deeply about what's happening. Um, when we were doing the training in Korea, uh, in order to give everybody the feeling for how you do a probe, um, we created a really neat simulation. And the simulation, we had 4 tables, and people uh, formed an airplane company, or if they formed a company that was delivering pens by flying them across the room. They had to, any flight that they made had to be um, at least 7 meters, and you got extra points if you threw a bunch of pens taped into the airplane 9 meters. And there was consultants that you could get money from, and when you delivered the pens, you got paid. And if your airplane fell short of the 7 meters, then somebody would come in and crunch the plane up, and you would lose all the pens. You had to buy your paper, and so it worked really well as little businesses. Nobody thought to ask, why are we being told to throw airplanes, to deliver pens by airplanes? What if, that they folded paper airplanes? What if we were to uh, offer to the customer, what if we were to offer to pull them in a paper boat? And then we could put more pens in. And nobody questioned that. Nobody came to the customer and said, why are you using airplanes? Why don't not take a boat? You get many more pens. And so that was an example of thinking deeply. Why are we thinking? Why are we accepting what we were given? Why aren't we trying to advise the customer? So that was if you really think deeply about why you're thinking, you'll come up with fantastic new ideas.
Mhm.
Um, Probe using formal experimental design. That's the Nova part. And um, we you it really, it turns out, really pays off to do this reflexive inquiry. Think of, we have these new ideas, let's test them out. Come up with a formal hypothesis that you write out, come up with an experimental design, do the experiment, and then see, what did we learn from that? Did the hypothesis get checked out? This really works, or it doesn't really quite work? And very importantly, you publish it, and we to your peers so that they can check it out and give you feedback. Um, and that, a lot of people do kind of informal experiments in the way they work, but they generally don't write it up and publish it, and that is the crucial piece that's often missing to really making progress about, gee, do these new ideas work? Um, the that one of the assignments that I gave everybody is on the first day is I said you can even do this for yourself. And so I said, come up with a probe for something in your own personal life, and tell us about it tomorrow. Well, people came up with some neat stuff. I'll give one example. Somebody said that when he gets off the metro to go home, um, he walks, and he was curious, saying, I'm going to take my iPhone and and see how long the iPhone says it should take me to walk, because my hypothesis is that I can actually walk faster than the iPhone says, that it's set for slower people. And so he said the walk was 20 minutes, and it took him, he said, I'll be at least 5 minutes quicker. And he did the walk in 12 minutes. And so there was his hypothesis, and he was telling us all about it. And he said the next thing he was going to do is do it with his wife and see how long that took, see if the thing was calibrated to the speed his wife walks. And other people, said, "Oh wow, I'm going to test that out too and see how I do." So we'll let you know. So that's the results of publishing. So it's a very simple experiment,
Mhm.
but if you don't have the formality about it, then you're not likely to be sharing your learning or even doing your learning in a disciplined way. Um, so that's just an example of the importance of using a formal experimental design and publishing to your peers. And I've had people do this in companies, and they say it's amazing. Hey, we have a monthly company gathering, and I came in and I published what I had done, and everybody was amazed, like wow, and they celebrated, and so it made a big impact to be able to give like a scientist does.
Mhm. But awesome. Thank you so much, John, for your time. It sounds like Korea was awesome. And I'm
Thank
so
you.
glad you got to do that. It has been really enlightening. And then, so outside of purchasing the Bossa Nova book, is available on Amazon and now in different translations. It seems like we will also be offering an online training for folks wanting to know more. And then we will we will be back. And we hope y'all have an amazing day.